Hello and welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. The U.S. and Iran are offering no clear path to resolving the war, as both claim they will be the ones to end the conflict. Meanwhile, Iran continues to threaten to block all oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, claiming responsibility for attacks on at least 15 vessels attempting to pass through the world's crucial oil choke point. South Korea says it'll release around 22 million barrels of oil from its strategic reserves as part of a coordinated action by the International Energy Agency members to launch the largest ever oil release to calm surging prices. At the National Assembly, lawmakers are set to pass a special bill later today that backs the $350 billion investment plan in the United States. The bill focuses on establishing a new body that would operate a dedicated investment fund financed through government contributions, entrusted assets, and investment bonds. It's been nearly 2 weeks since the conflict in the Middle East ignited. Both the United States and Iran insist they will be the ones to end the war, deepening a standoff with no clear path to a resolution. Our An Sung-jin has the details.
U.S. President Donald Trump said the ongoing situation in Iran could end, quote, whenever I want. In a phone interview with Axios on Wednesday, he insisted the military campaign was going very well and that the U.S. forces were ahead of schedule.
We don't want to leave early, do we? We got to finish the job, right? Over the past 11 days, our military has virtually destroyed Iran.
The White House also emphasized that the operation would only end when Trump determines that the military objectives have been fully achieved. Israel, fighting alongside the U.S., stated that it will not impose a time limit on its campaign until all objectives are achieved and victory is secured. However, Iranian officials rejected the idea that Washington can unilaterally decide when the conflict ends.
I have repeatedly warned Trump, you can start a war, but we will decide how it ends.
Iran has reportedly rejected 2 ceasefire messages delivered through Trump's envoy. According to The Guardian, the internal consensus among Iran's leadership largely favors continuing the fight for now, with officials believing the regime can endure the conflict. Meanwhile, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has claimed responsibility for attacks on vessels attempting to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. At least 15 vessels in the area have been attacked since the beginning of hostilities, with Iran continuing to threaten to block all oil shipments through the waterway. The U.S. has warned of possible airstrikes on civilian ports as retaliatory measures. With the Strait of Hormuz being one of the world's most critical energy corridors, fears are mounting that global energy prices could surge if the strait remains closed. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
South Korea will release more than 22 million barrels of oil from its strategic reserves as part of the International Energy Agency's largest ever coordinated stock draw. The move comes as global crude oil prices remain volatile despite plans by the 32 member nations to inject 400 million barrels into the market amid ongoing Middle East tensions. Our Lee Seung-jae has more.
South Korea plans to release 22.46 million barrels of oil from its strategic reserves as part of a coordinated action by member countries of the International Energy Agency aimed at stabilizing global energy markets. Seoul's industry ministry announced the plan on Wednesday, shortly after the 32 member nations of the Paris-based agency unanimously agreed to carry out the largest collective oil stock release in the organization's history. In total, about 400 million barrels of oil will be made available to the market in an effort to ease supply disruptions and curb rising crude prices linked to the ongoing war involving the United States, Israel, and Iran.
As a result of the discussions among IEA members, I can now announce that IEA countries have unanimously decided to launch the largest ever release of emergency oil stocks in our agency's history. IEA countries will be making 400 million barrels of oil available.
South Korea's contribution represents about 5.6% of the total volume to be released. The size of each country's release was calculated based on its share of overall oil consumption among IEA members. The U.S. Energy Department also issued a press release saying the administration would release 172 million barrels of oil from its reserves. Officials say the timing and detailed schedule of the coordinated release will be determined in the coming period. The decision comes as global oil markets continue to show volatility despite expectations of increased supply. On Wednesday, Brent crude rose 4.8% to $91.98 per barrel on the ICE Futures Exchange in London. U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude also climbed 4.6% to $87.25 per barrel, moving above levels seen before the IEA announcement. Analysts say the record release underscores the urgency among major economies to prevent further spikes in oil prices and limit the broader economic impact of the conflict. 이승재, Arirang News.
Concerns are growing here in Seoul as the United States is reportedly moving air defense assets stationed in South Korea out of the country for use in the conflict in the Middle East. For more on this, we're joined today by Professor Andrew Millard, head of the Department of International Relations at Changwon National University. Professor Miller, thanks for coming on today. There are concerns that the U.S. may be redeploying air defense assets stationed in Korea for use in the war with Iran, right? What could this mean for South Korea's security?
Good morning. Thanks for having me again. So yes, I mean, there have been reports that the US, if not already, that very soon will start deploying both Patriot missiles and also parts of the THAAD air defense system to the Middle East. Now, the South Korean government has been very quick to reassure people that even if these deployments do happen, that South Korea still has more than enough capabilities to deter any sort of aggression from North Korea or anyone else. And we should also remember, even if the US does deploy some of these weapons and systems, this is not a complete withdrawal of the US forces. This is just a very small fraction. So there'll be more than enough US capabilities remaining in Korea to defend Korea in any case of attack. But we should also remember, for the past year, President Lee has been really pushing to regain full operational control, not only in peacetime, but also in times of conflict. So we should be very clear that South Korea is capable of deterring any attack. And we should also factor in the account that if there were some sort of aggression against South Korea, this would be a very different type of conflict. This would not be only the US and South Korea, but South Korea, as we know, is part of the NATO plus IP4 group. So if there was any sort of aggression against South Korea, we would expect support from other countries, other members of the NATO plus IP4 group. So really, overall, even if some of these redeployments do happen, South Korea, in terms of security, it's still in an incredibly strong position.
I see. And while that's happening, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs is currently in South Korea. How might Korean and U.S. officials address the situation in the Middle East?
So I think there's likely going to be several different issues that they're going to talk about. So you mentioned just before at the start about the oil and South Korea releasing these 22 million barrels of oil reserves. So definitely the economic impact and the oil crisis, this is going to be something they'll discuss. But in terms of security, we should expect that South Korea and the US are going to come out with a very united front. So South Korea will support officially any sort of redeployment of weapons. And we should point out, these would also be fairly short-term redeployments. Once the war in Iran is finished, we don't know when that's going to be, but those weapons will likely be redeployed back to Korea. So the South Koreans will fully support the US, but they'll also likely discuss certain issues like the relationship between North Korea and Iran. What potential intelligence sharing there is between North Korea and Iran? Is there any weapons technology being shared? What cooperation is happening? And also, if there was some sort of escalation, again, how would they counter that in the future?
Right, you just talked about North Korea. Could this meeting also provide an opportunity to sort of discuss bringing North Korea back to dialogue, especially since President Donald Trump is planning to travel to Beijing to meet with China's Xi Jinping next month?
Right. So President Lee, he's come into office last June, so he's been about 9 months now. He was very clear from the start that he wanted to re-engage with North Korea. He wanted to restart the dialogue. Now, so far, this has not been successful. So it's quite clear that direct attempts to have dialogue with North Korea have failed. And so basically now his option is to sort of go through relations with other countries. And what we're seeing right now, so today, for example, North Korea and China, for the first time in 6 years, they are going to reopen the rail links between the countries. So those were closed after the start of COVID. So this shows that North Korea and China have very good relations. So what the South Koreans can do is they can try and push the US when Donald Trump meets with Xi Jinping in April to try to have China encourage North Korea to come back to the table for some dialogue. But of course, there needs to be some sort of agenda. They need to try to incentivize North Korea to come back to the table. At the moment, what is the benefit for North Korea to do this? Right now, as we've seen, North Korea, it's really starting to expand its relations elsewhere. So how can South Korea really push them?
Right, and what North Korea said yesterday is that leader Kim Jong-un oversaw a cruise missile test from a naval destroyer, and this was the second test of its kind in a week, right? What might be behind this move?
So I don't think we should really be reading too much into this. Of course, this is a sign that North Korea is continuing to expand its military, continuing to develop its weapons system and improve, modernize the technology. And we've definitely seen over the past sort of few months, past year, North Korea has been focusing a lot more on its navy, on expanding its maritime capabilities. And so these tests, which, let's face it, even though we criticize North Korea a lot, they do regularly carry out these missile tests. So again, we know it's been expanding its naval capabilities. We know it tests missiles regularly. So this is just a continuation of that development. So it's significant in that clearly they are continuing to develop, but it's not something that's sort of out of the blue and completely unexpected.
I see. All right, Professor Miller, thank you so much for coming on today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
South Korea's National Assembly is set to pass a special bill later today to manage strategic investments in the United States. The legislation would establish a new body to carry out a memorandum of understanding, pledging $350 billion in investment in the United States. The body would operate a dedicated investment fund financed through government contributions, entrusted assets, and investment bonds. Lawmakers are also expected to request a parliamentary probe into alleged politically motivated prosecutions under the former administration of former President Yoon Suk-yeol and vote on dozens of additional livelihood and reform bills. Meanwhile, President Lee Jae-myung has hosted his Ghanaian counterpart for talks. Strengthening cooperation on trade, critical minerals, and maritime security topped the agenda. Our Blue House correspondent Yoon Jung-min reports.
Bolstering the partnership was the focal point as President Lee Jae-myung hosted his Ghanaian counterpart, John Mahama, noting the two countries' shared experiences of achieving democracy and the increasing trade volume.
서아프리카 3개국과 국경을 맞대고 있는 해양국 가나는 대한민국의 아프리카 시장 진출을 잇는 든든한 교두보이기도 합니다. 그리고 최근에는 매우 큰 규모의 벼 재배 단지를 함께 조성해서 내년부터 한국산 벼 종자를 생산할 예정으로 있습니다.
Ghana, like other African countries, has a potential for critical minerals. And so currently we're exploiting bauxite, manganese, and gold. And we've discovered vast reserves of lithium. Korea has the technology, and we believe that we can explore these minerals together.
Maritime security was also high on the agenda.
가나는 해적 위협이 상존하는 기니만에서 우리 대한민국 국민들의 안전을 지키는데 그동안 적극적으로 협조해 준 참으로 고마운 나라이기도 합니다.
The issue of piracy is of major concern to Korea, just as it is to Ghana. And so I'm happy that one of the memorandums we're going to sign is to do with maritime safety.
MOUs were signed on Wednesday for cooperation not only on maritime security, but also on technology and science, as well as joint tackling of climate change. There was a friendly atmosphere as the leaders touched upon a link between the two countries, represented by Ghana Chocolate, a chocolate bar made from Ghanaian cocoa that was launched in Korea more than 50 years ago. Lee has presented Mahama with the chocolate, who's on a working visit to South Korea. The sentiment was extended to cultural and people-to-people exchanges.
가나 현지에서도 영화, 식품, 화장품 같은 우리 문화가 큰 사랑을 받고 있다고 알고 있습니다.
When I was coming, somebody asked me to bring them back kimchi. And our young people, including my children, listen to K-pop music.
Seoul's top office added that the leaders also addressed regional and global issues, including the Middle East, and said it hoped to expand the nation's diplomatic horizons. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
In sports, Team Korea added 2 more silver medals at this year's Winter Paralympics in Milan Cortina, surpassing the country's previous best performance at a single Winter Paralympics set at the 2018 Pyeongchang Games. Kim Yoon-ji claimed silver in the women's 10-kilometer cross-country interval start on Wednesday, giving her 1 gold and 2 silver medals at this year's Games. Kim has now also set a new national record for the most medals won by a South Korean athlete at a single Winter Paralympics. In wheelchair curling mixed doubles, Baek Hye-jin and Lee Yong-seok secured silver after a 9-7 loss to China in a final that went into extra ends. South Korea has won 5 medals, 1 gold, 3 silver, and 1 bronze. Over the weekend, the world observed International Women's Day, celebrating the progress made while reflecting on key challenges that still lie ahead in terms of advancing gender equality. The UN Women's Center in Seoul held a ceremony to commemorate the day on Wednesday to invite experts to delve into the discourse. Our Kim Bo-kyung was there.
Though Korean society has seen significant progress in gender equality, there is still a gap that cannot be narrowed enough. Not just in lower representation in economic activities and leadership, but also in terms of a digital society and crime.
As AI becomes part of everyday life, we must address problems like deepfakes used for digital sex crimes and gender-based violence in relationships. Gender equality is a value for everyone, and it is key to making our society more inclusive, resilient, and sustainable.
Commemorating this year's International Women's Day, the UN Women Knowledge and Partnership Center in Seoul held a ceremony, inviting pundits who have witnessed ongoing gender inequalities and are trying to overcome them. Among the speakers was a math professor who emphasized that AI learns from already unfair data, causing itself to learn discrimination against women.
If different perspectives are missing when technology is designed, it can create bias. When this technology is used in hiring, healthcare, or the justice system, it can make discrimination part of the system. Women's participation in science and technology is not just about numbers. It is about fairness.
Gender equality is not just a women's matter, in that gender equality lets men go beyond the traditional idea of being manly, come out of the so-called man box. The progress in equality allows men to be freed.
I believe that when men accept and take part in gender equality, it can also help solve men's problems and bring them greater freedom. For men who want to move away from the patriarchy but feel confused within a strong patriarchal system, gender equality can offer a real solution and a new model of masculinity.
Gender bias and discrimination still exist across many areas of society, often unconsciously. By encouraging open discussion on these issues, South Korea aims to move toward a more gender-equal society, not only for women, but for everyone. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Good morning, I'm Chu Ji-hyun, and this is The World Now. Reports suggest that a devastating missile strike on an Iranian girls' school was due to U.S. forces using outdated intelligence. Video evidence points to a U.S. Tomahawk missile hitting the school in southern Minab during the opening wave of attacks against Iran. The strike killed 150 students. Sources told Reuters that military planners used outdated targeting packages and didn't update coordinates. The school sat adjacent to a Revolutionary Guard compound. President Trump stated he will await the final results of the inquiry, while defense officials maintain the U.S. does not deliberately target civilian structures. G7 leaders on Wednesday rejected easing of sanctions against Russia, despite the disruption to the global energy markets caused by the war in the Middle East. French President Emmanuel Macron confirmed the decision following a high-level video meeting to discuss the economic impact of the U.S.-Iran conflict. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen backed Macron's stance, saying it is, quote, not the moment to relax sanctions on Russia. She also emphasized that navigation through the strategic Strait of Hormuz, through which around 20% of the world's oil is moved, remains the immediate priority. In Chile, conservative leader Jose Antonio Kast has taken the oath of office as the country's president, vowing to prioritize national security and economic reform. Kast assumed power in Valparaiso on Wednesday. Chile's new president immediately pledged to utilize the full force of law to clamp down on illegal migration and violent crime. Regional leaders from Argentina, Ecuador, and Paraguay attended the ceremony. Iran's sports minister announced on Wednesday that the Iranian national team will not participate in the 2026 FIFA World Cup. Sports Minister Ahmad Donyamali cited the U.S. assassination of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei as the primary reason for the boycott and labeled the U.S. a, quote, corrupt regime. This comes despite FIFA President Gianni Infantino saying that U.S. President Donald Trump would welcome the team. All of Iran's scheduled group stage matches were set to take place in American cities, including Los Angeles and Seattle.
Western regions will have fine early spring weather under mostly sunny skies, but across the eastern parts of Korea, rain and gusty winds are expected. There could be 5 to 20 millimeters of rainfall along with thunderstorms, while Gyeongsang-do provinces will see spotty rain, which won't be enough to lift the dry weather alerts. Meanwhile, mountainous regions in Gangwon-do province will be snowy with more than 20 centimeters of snowfall expected through tomorrow, with a heavy snow advisory being issued. And instead of wet weather, most of the western regions will be trapped in that dusty air through the morning, but air quality should gradually improve later in the afternoon. And this afternoon, Seoul will be getting up to 13 degrees Celsius. Daegu, Gyeongju will be topping out at 12 degrees. Now, rain and snow along the east coast will continue through Friday, while the rest of the country will have typical early spring weather with big temperature swings.
Now that's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at noon Korea time. Thanks for watching.